As the fifth generation of home consoles was coming to a close, things weren't looking too good for Nintendo. While the Nintendo 64 enjoyed modest popularity, the PlayStation was undoubtedly in the lead commercially. Not only that, but the Nintendo 64 very quickly drew complaints throughout its lifespan, often with comparisons to the PlayStation that landed more in Sony's favor. Nintendo had to do something. Let's take things back a few years. In the mid-1990s, Nintendo was working very closely with Silicon Graphics, who are known for their workstation computers designed to produce high-end 3D models and animation for movies and video games, such as Rare's Donkey Kong Country series. With real-time rendered 3D graphics becoming the next big leap in gaming, Nintendo enlisted engineers from Silicon Graphics to work with them on their next console, dubbed the Nintendo Ultra 64, before it was renamed to the Nintendo 64. However, making something as low-end as a consumer games console is relatively uncharted territory for the engineers, and unfortunately this ended up showing in the final product. The hardware for the Nintendo 64 was very much an enigma. For one, the system lacked a sound card, resulting in the system constantly having to allocate memory from the CPU for sound. The Nintendo 64 also used general RAM, and this combined with the sound, amongst other variables, meant that the system had a very serious problem when it came to performance. It was also notorious for being a nightmare for developers to work on. That, and with 3D games by their nature being more taxing to develop, in addition to this being a time where they were a very new concept for most developers, this left a lot of Nintendo 64 games falling victim to being unpolished affairs with poor performance and ugly screen filters. And it's not like developers could fall back on prior background and work on 2D games because the N64's 2D capabilities were practically non-existent. While the Nintendo 64 could produce better 3D visuals than the PlayStation, if there was a multi-platform release that was on both systems, the PlayStation version was almost always the better version to go with, and this didn't go unnoticed by gamers. That's not even getting into the Nintendo 64's controller. It became clear to Nintendo that Sony won this round. Now it was a matter of how to fight back. Nintendo approached their next console project under the mindset of trying to rectify everything they did wrong last time. However, they would still enlist a lot of people connected to the Nintendo 64 in some way. Silicon Graphics was experiencing a lot of internal conflicts leading up to the Nintendo 64's launch, and various teams of people within their ranks separated and split off into their own ventures, such as 3DFX and RX, the latter of which being the people Nintendo would work with for the GameCube. RX consisted of the engineers who worked on the Nintendo 64, and in 1998 they began working on Flipper, the system logic and graphics processor for what was then called Project Dolphin. Their work on Flipper was deemed as very impressive and gained recognition throughout their industry before they were eventually bought by ATI in 2000. RX was also far from the only third-party Nintendo reached out to. The CPU was developed by IBM, and the GameCube's proprietary mini-DVD-based format and the hardware used to read it was developed by Panasonic. At this point, the choices Nintendo made about which third parties to partner with for this Dolphin project seem to be very conventional. However, there is one that defies expectations. Factor 5. For those of you not familiar with them, I'm guessing you are very new to this channel, they were a game development studio. They weren't known for making hardware as much as they were known for pushing it. Their games often had a reputation of being among the most technically impressive on pretty much every system they have ever worked on, and their work on the Nintendo 64 in particular is what got Nintendo's attention. Their first N64 game, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, got a lot of publicity upon release for its graphics. However, it's the sound that got Nintendo interested. Not only did the game have a very involved dynamic soundtrack, but the game had around 80 minutes of voice acting and sound effects while retaining a surprising level of quality.
During the Talaran operation, a team of rebel commandos stole several AT-PTs from an Imperial base on Fest. Unfortunately, their escape did not proceed as well as they expected.
This was achieved through Factor 5's own custom sound system, which was quickly licensed and used by tons of other developers for other Nintendo 64 games, including some first-party Nintendo ones. So they were brought on board to work on the GameCube sound system and worked very close to RX as the sound card was embedded onto the graphics chip. Now with the hardware itself underway, Nintendo needed to build up a software library. And a controller. Nintendo worked on the controller for ages and went through several different revisions. Shigeru Miyamoto expressed a desire to give emphasis to the A button, expressing its role as the primary button on Nintendo systems, feeling that the controller design itself should reflect that. The GameCube was also supposed to have slightly higher specs than what we got in the end, but they had to downclock it a little as the hardware yields weren't good enough. As Nintendo was building up their software library and making final tweaks to the GameCube, Sony released the PlayStation 2. Hype from the machine was maddening.
You don't have to go to Wall Street to find the hottest thing on the market right now.
It's PlayStation 2 video game consoles.
Nintendo wasn't fazed by this though, largely due to the GameCube having significantly better specs and also being much easier to develop games for, not to mention, the system was cheaper. It was clear that Nintendo kept good on what they set out to do. They made a machine that responded to all of the Nintendo 64's shortcomings in comparison to the PlayStation, to the point of being more capable than their competitor's successor. However, if there was one crucial mistake that they absolutely did not learn from, it was their attitude. They allowed Sony to soak up the media attention as the PS2 sold like hotcakes. The high sales numbers led directly to developers flocking to the thing. After all, the more people own a platform, the more potential customers a developer will have. Of course, this could also lead to the opposite, where a market becomes so oversaturated that it becomes hard to get noticed. However, in this crucial early period, this was almost too good for Sony. Also, because Nintendo was behind on producing development kits, and thus were picky about what studios got them, most studios opted to instead support the PS2 as it was already successful, had already had development kits available.
Your overconfidence is your weakness.
Your faith in your DVD player is yours. In fact, let's talk about that DVD player because it was a big deal. At the time, the DVD format was really exciting and people sought after the DVD players ravenously. The only issue was, they were pricey. Now, here Sony comes along and says, hey, can't figure out if you want a DVD player or a video game console? Get the PS2! It does both, and it's cheaper than a DVD player! Not only did Nintendo display no desire to implement DVD playback, but they couldn't do it even if they wanted to. The optical drive was designed around the proprietary mini-DVD based format. A regular DVD wouldn't even fit. Panasonic would release a version of the GameCube called the Q that could, but was only sold in Japan and it failed to sell. Nowadays it's highly sought after and is exceptionally difficult to get. However, Nintendo was still confident in the GameCube's abilities as a game machine, and the pressure was on the developers making games for the thing in Q4 2001 to prove whether this confidence was warranted. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for criticism to arise. This was the first Nintendo system to not launch with a main Mario game, and the title in its place, Luigi's Mansion, was immediately laughed at. The GameCube was starting to gain a reputation for being a kiddie console, even if upon retrospect that conclusion doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Nintendo got Texas-based Retro Studios to make games catered to older audiences for the system's launch. However, things were not going well at Retro. The staff was underpaid and overworked. Meanwhile, the higher-ups were partaking in some pretty shady operations, namely using company money to run porn sites among other forms of embezzlement. Studio head Jeff Spangenberg was hardly ever in the studio, and after a particularly long absence, a photo surfaced of him on the internet in a hot tub with a bunch of half-naked women. Jeff Spangenberg sold his part of Retro to Nintendo and went on to head top-heavy studios who would make the Guy game. After Spangenberg's departure, Nintendo put Retro's remains on the project that would become synonymous with the studio, but that wouldn't make the launch window. Nintendo's first-party lineup had a lot of momentum and promise, but older audiences who weren't immediately excited by Nintendo's IPs were largely alienated. Nintendo would not only need a game that appealed to older audiences, but they would need it soon, and thankfully, they would have it at launch. Star Wars Rogue Squadron 2 Rogue Leader has a very interesting place in GameCube history. Factor 5 made a demo of it for Space World 2000 only to find that all of the other GameCube demos were pre-rendered videos. Here they spent 19 stressful days trying to get this thing running in real time, and yet Zelda, Donkey Kong Racing, and Luigi's Mansion were just pre-rendered? Then, as the game entered official development and was shown to the public, the graphics were so incomprehensibly good that everyone assumed that they were pre-rendered, some even claiming that these were the same CG models from the Star Wars Trilogy Special Edition. The GameCube's other games already looked really impressive, but this was so far and above even those that people literally couldn't believe it. There was absolutely no way this game looks this good, let alone run at 60 frames per second. However, as the game got closer to release and demo kiosks started appearing in stores, and as the press got their hands on it, one thing became certain. Holy crap, this is real. even taking into account all of the other GameCube games that came out afterwards. This remains one of the most impressive games on the system, and it came out right out of the gates at the system's launch. Granted, the game also being really damn good helps too. There were magazines that were saying, get a GameCube just to play Rogue Leader. This wasn't just a cool licensed game, it was a system seller, and at least for a while, it helped combat the kiddie image of the GameCube. The GameCube's Q4 2001 lineup was insane. There were a lot of really good games, instant classics even being released at an unprecedented pace. Even just counting console exclusives at the time, you had Luigi's Mansion, Rogue Leader, Wave Race Blue Storm, Super Monkey Ball, Super Smash Bros. Melee, Pikmin, and if you include multi-platform games, you got stuff like Crazy Taxi, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, Simpsons Road Rage, SSX Tricky, and Extreme G3. All of that is within just the first 43 days. And keep in mind, I'm leaving out quite a few games and just leaving it to the bigger titles that people still talk about to some degree. That's a really good start. Not only was Nintendo releasing great successors to existing titles, but they were making really good original titles that helped give the console its own identity really early on. Pikmin, for instance, was the game that sold me completely on the GameCube as a kid. However, even now we were starting to get titles from Sega. While these were largely ports from the Dreamcast and the arcade, these ports served as the introduction to these games for many kids, the most notable in particular being Sonic Adventure 2, which got a lot of press on the GameCube largely out of the then surreal nature of seeing a big Sonic game on a Nintendo system, and of course it was also one of the earlier games to feature Game Boy Advance connectivity, so it was pushed pretty hard. However, where was that plumber during all of this? Nintendo started working on prototypes for a game with a water pump mechanic. They decided to apply this mechanic to Mario and use it to expand upon the strengths of Mario 64. The game went through many revisions and changes, with the end result being more rushed than the studio would have liked. Mario Sunshine was pretty divisive upon launch, but it's honestly a personal favorite of mine and a lot of other people around my age. There are also a few games from the Nintendo 64. Animal Crossing was previously released for the Nintendo 64 disc drive in Japan and made its release in North America in 2002 for the GameCube. Despite the Nintendo 64 graphics, the game quickly got a following for its laid-back and charming nature. Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem started development on the Nintendo 64 before it transitioned to the GameCube. It was a psychological horror game where you play as multiple characters set in different time periods, uncovering a plot against humanity. The game was adored by critics, but didn't sell well. Now the game has a cult following, and rightfully so, because it's really good. This was also one of the only first-party Nintendo games to have an M rating, and the other big one was also on the GameCube. Nintendo also wanted a first-person shooter with a unique feel to it. N-Space caught wind of this and started to work on an FPS where he plays an Invisible Man. After sending it to Nintendo and listening to their feedback, the title evolved into Geist. However, Nintendo and N-Space continued to have creative differences on the title's direction, leading to a troubled development cycle. Despite the game being shown off at E3 2003, it wouldn't come out until 2005, which was far too late to turn the GameCube's kiddie reputation around. The very divisive Star Fox Adventure started off on the Nintendo 64 as Dinosaur Planet. It was a Zelda-inspired adventure game that was set to be Rare's magnum opus. However, not only was the Nintendo 64's lifespan coming to a close, but Shigeru Miyamoto asked Rare to rework the game as a Star Fox spin-off. It was ported to the GameCube in this form, but was missing pretty much half of what they set out to do in Dinosaur Planet. Rare was fed up with Nintendo's creative control and investigated selling to a third-party publisher so that they could work on not just the GameCube, but the PS2 and Xbox. However, it was Microsoft that bought them out, and at first it seemed like they weren't going to be as strict as Nintendo was, but it turned out that they were even more so. Nonetheless, Nintendo lost a valuable developer, and unfortunately, they wouldn't be the last. Third-party support was starting to dry up as the GameCube started to lag behind its competitors. The mini-DVD format proved to be a mistake, especially as the generation went on and games started gearing for longer, more story-driven experiences. If those games were to be made or ported to the GameCube, they would either need multiple discs manufactured, or the graphics would have to be compressed to the point where it made the system look bad.
Hey, SpongeBob! Seems to be the Great Piston Patrick.
What?
It seems that the GameCube's kiddie image didn't just come from the games themselves, but the design of the system, the fact that it could only play video games, and the lower price. Therefore, the PS2 was an entertainment hub. The GameCube was a toy. It also hurt that not only did older audiences ignore the GameCube, but even amongst kids, things weren't too much better. The PS2 grabbed that market too. Capcom tried to rectify this with what they called the Capcom 5 planned exclusives to help reinvigorate the system. Well, one of those games never came out, one of them wasn't very good, and when the others did well, they were quickly ported to the other platforms, thus defeating the entire purpose. Nintendo was basically helpless no matter what games were cranked out for the thing, because the GameCube existed in this strange environment where games didn't matter. Xbox also pushed its online service, Xbox Live, really hard, and Sony was also keeping up the pace with online play. Nintendo? Not really. They did have a modem adapter and a broadband adapter for online play, however the only game you could play online was Phantasy Star Online. There were games that supported LAN play, like Mario Kart Double Dash and Kirby Air Ride, but even then the modem adapter didn't support LAN mode, leaving that attachment usable as pretty much one game. The GameCube was exceptionally good at playing games, and it had a lot of truly fantastic games to play. However, the lack of a DVD player, online play, and the lower storage capacity made it unattractive to many. Publishers and developers started an exodus around this time, and even ones who stood by the system left it behind. This meant a lot of cancelled games. It's not that we didn't get good games from 2004 onwards, but a lot of them were announced before then. There were less surprises and there was less excitement. Once everyone else left, things were slower than they were before. I remember when the Wii came out, I was more than ready to move on because there really wasn't anything left on the horizon and things had been pretty dry for a while. However, when I got that Wii, I largely used it as a second GameCube, especially when Nintendo's main offerings started getting bland and uninspired after a few years into that system. Then I just used it for soft modding. In contrast, what Nintendo did with their main franchises during the GameCube era was interesting, fresh, and exciting, especially to relative newcomers at the time such as myself. Seeing Mario Sunshine screenshots in magazines and footage of Mario using a water pump as a jetpack allowing the player to hover in the air, that shit was amazing. Though as the years have gone by and DVD players have gotten cheaper, and as the other 6th-gen consoles lost online multiplayer support, officially anyway, leaving these systems with just their games, the GameCube has been much more appreciated in retrospect. It went from being kind of a lame duck to maybe the most talked about out of all of the 6th-gen consoles. Also, due to its durable nature and good build quality, it's a better system to go back to nowadays, unlike some of its competition. As a kid, I was quick to flock to the GameCube. I liked what I saw on the PS2 as well, but the GameCube's games just captured my imagination in a way the PS2 or Xbox never could. The games just felt more unique, fresh, and exciting. I didn't care that it didn't have a DVD player. Granted, I was also that weird kid who was content with VHS. I was excited by DVDs too, but if I was that desperate, my parents' computer upstairs had a DVD drive in it. I wasn't bothered by the alleged kid-oriented games because I was a kid when they were new, and even as an adult I still find myself enjoying them a lot. While it's a shame that the GameCube didn't get a lot of support, the library itself is bizarrely consistent in quality. It may not have done too well during its run, but like a fine wine, the GameCube has benefited from the passage of time.